blowing up the map in my historic atlas 15 times to a scale of 100,000, the scale of the hiking maps we then used. This, of course, made it necessary for me to invent temples, villages, roads, forests, and much else. I made myself king of Melos. I chose Melos because I liked the shape of the island. As a child, I thus recreated Greece, a magical Greece that allowed me to forget the misery of post-war Germany. In this imaginary landscape, filled with the presence of gods and the home to heroes, I felt at home. Recreating Greece is, of course, a very German thing to do. Think of Winkelmann, Goethe, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. As an undergraduate, I toyed with the idea of becoming a classicist. In the end, I turned to philosophy, but this philosopher's journey began with dreams of Greece. I was thus excited when I received the invitation to participate in the symposium. Also a bit unsure just what form my contribution should take. The organizers stated an aim for a critical reevaluation of the very term and notion of the landscape and its potential value as a meeting ground for strategic collaborations spoke to many of the concerns that have long occupied me. But the title of the symposium, Under the Landscape, left me wondering just how I should approach it. Quite a number of possible readings of the phrase come to mind. The meaning of both words, landscape and under, put by the organizers of the symposium in scare quotes as if to warn us not to take their meaning for granted, was indeed not at all clear to me. The phrase under the landscapes invites, first of all, a search for what lies hidden beneath the landscape, geological strata perhaps, that speak of processes that shape to the landscape we see. Think of Santorini and Therasia, once part of one circular island, said to have had the name Strongili, the round one. But this circular island, formed by volcanic activity going back 2 million years, was sundered by a catastrophic volcanic eruption around 1600 BC. An explosion that buried what had been a flourishing community under a thick mantle of pumice and ash, and that helped create the landscape that today has made Santorini one of the world's top tourist destinations. Or under the landscape may bring to mind the natural resources buried under many a landscape, resources such as coal, oil, natural gas, and iron ore, which have made possible the Industrial Revolution and our modern way of life, and have transformed and are still transforming the world's landscapes in ways that demand our thoughtful response. Do traditional landscapes still have a place in our modern world? Is their place not rather in some sort of museum watched over by those concerned and entrusted with preserving a country's heritage? So understood, what lies under the landscape has made possible a process that had to destroy traditional landscapes and the associated way of life. And for that very reason, has led those unwilling to simply accept that loss to try to preserve what can still be saved. The phrase under the landscape also invites thoughts of long buried traces of past cultures now being uncovered by archaeologists. Every landscape has been shaped by a particular history. What lies under the landscape often testifies to that history. Think of what excavations on Santorini and Therasia have brought to light. Some of the recovered treasures are now exhibited in the Museum of Prehistoric Thera, covering the island's history starting from the late Neolithic period to the beginning of the late Cycladic period. The exhibits speak to us of a way of life that has perished. And so does the now almost deserted village of Agrilia on Therasia, now the object of loving restoration and preservation work by Boulouki. But the way of life that once shaped this village and this island cannot be recovered. Today, we demand not only running water, electricity, and modern medical services, but an openness to the world that depends on modern means of communication, including car and airplane, telephone and computer. The intimate connection of human beings and the land that shaped so many traditional societies cannot be recovered. And yet, many of us are attracted to a way of life incompatible with the way we actually live. Is there perhaps something important that this vanished way of life has to teach us? I mentioned some of the thoughts that the phrase "under the landscape" brought to my mind. Under every landscape lie geological features that contributed to its appearance. Under many a landscape lie resources that have scarred it, but that also made our modern way of life possible, even as today their ruthless exploitation has led to a climate crisis that imperils the future of humanity, demanding that we change the way we deal with the land, water, and earth. And finally, buried beneath every landscape lie traces of the past that shaped it. There is thus a sense in which under every landscape lies its history. But I am neither a geologist, nor an archaeologist, nor a historian. If I was to contribute to the symposium, I had to look in a different direction. And that would seem to be in keeping with what the organizers of the symposium had in mind. That, at least, is suggested by the explanatory statement that accompanied the announcement of the symposium. I cite the introductory paragraph. In various debates concerning the multiple crises that have marked the first part of the 21st century, the notion of landscape has become a pivotal term, from the rhetoric of global organization to social media imagery, and from the Venice Biennale to tourism advertising campaigns. Landscape travels across different spheres of culture, interconnecting notions of beauty and survival, heritage and leisure, natural resources and identities. Whether in strategies for efficiency and resilience in the face of total environmental catastrophe, or in approaches that challenge human-centric worldviews, the notion of the landscape is there, making it increasingly imperative to critically examine this growing topicality and ubiquity. What lies under the landscape? Suggestive as this statement is, as mentioned, it left me wondering just how I was to address the concluding question. How was I to understand this under? The word under invites us to dig deeper, to look at what lies beneath the landscape. But in the statement I just read, landscape too appears in scare quotes, suggesting a concern with the way what the word signifies has proliferated and become increasingly problematic as it has come to be used in countless different cultural contexts. Today, the word can have all sorts of different meanings and connotations, raising countless different questions. What lies beneath this confusing multiplicity? When I hear the word landscape, what comes to mind first of all are images, not images of the lunar landscape space travel has allowed us to see, nor of industrial landscapes, which often have their own beauty, nor of sublime nature in which we feel homeless, but images of landscapes whose beauty is tied to the way in which generations made their living, found and are still finding their home in this place. Human beings are very much part of landscapes so understood. History has shaped them in a way that seems to project the way of life that formed them into the future. To see such landscapes threatened by exploitation and development saddens me. In this so many ways troubled and troubling world, I find the thought and even more the experience of such landscapes comforting. Their seeming permanence reinforces my faith in this world. As I hear the word landscape, it is first of all charged with nostalgia. But nostalgia here is not just oriented to a past that is no longer, but to a future, to a conviction that we need to change the way we deal with the land. Traditional landscapes challenge us to change our way. Nostalgia can be and is often the shadow of despair over reality. The gulf that separates us from the landscapes that move us can become too deep to be crossed. A beautiful brief poem by Franz Werfel, a Bohemian Jew forced into exile by the Nazis, unable to call any place on earth home, comes to my mind. Impossible to translate, I give you only an altogether inadequate paraphrase. Das Bleibende, the permanent. As long as the Tatra wind gently caresses Slovak flowers, girls will stitch them into touching embroideries. As long as the axe rings in the Bavarian forest as day breaks, there will be the solitary old man carving God and the saints. As long as the Ligurian sea watches its fishermen, it will see on its shore the women making their lace. What touches me, you people of the earth, is the permanent that you enact. I, without people, without land, cradle my head in my hand. The first three stanzas conjure up specific landscapes and human beings who belong to them. The poet no doubt knows that what touched him was a dream of landscapes that had no longer a place in the world in which he found himself, a dream of human beings being at home, even as he knew that in this sense, he would never feel at home, and not just because of the terrible times in which he lived. But such dreams console us. Landscape here is a figure of paradise lost. But even though paradise is denied to us, the landscape that figure it provide bittersweet comfort. And are we not all in need of such comfort, even as we know that paradise lies irretrievably behind us? But if such dreams are not to become obstacles to confronting and coping with reality, they must not just raise images of some irretrievably lost past, but must beckon us toward a better future. These are different times, terrible in their own way. They let me too dream of landscapes where I would truly feel at home, knowing full well that for me there can be no such place. But such dreams cast a light into this in so many ways imperfect world that counters despair and lets me look more hopefully into the future. Certain landscapes have given me that sense. Franconia, Maine, Virginia, Tuscany, and now Vieques, a small island off Puerto Rico, where I hope to spend a good part of whatever time is still granted to me. But the landscape that I associate most readily with such an experience is Upper Bavaria. More than any other landscape, it figures that paradise for me in which I do not believe. I paid it homage with my books on the Bavarian Rococo Church. Such experiences are, of course, highly subjective. They depend on one's personal history, on memories that connect us with particular landscapes. No doubt, my appreciation of the beauty of such landscape is colored by nostalgia, by dreams of homecoming, where nostalgia mingles with a vague hope for a better future. And nostalgia attends the way I hear the word landscape, first of all, and most of the time, quite aware that often it has very different meanings. And no doubt, nostalgia shadows my thinking of the importance of place as it found expression in the ethical function of architecture. But is nostalgia not to be condemned for failing to confront the challenges of present and future? Such critiques are often no doubt justified. Nostalgia can prevent us from meeting the challenge of what happens to be our reality. But as mentioned, nostalgia can also have a critical function by opposing to this in so many ways deficient world, images of landscapes into which we read our dreams of a more fully human existence. Nostalgia may contribute towards the establishment of a better future. My response to the word landscape reflects my personal history. Many, perhaps most of you, including perhaps the organizers of this symposium, may well have a different and much more encompassing understanding of what the word means. I thus felt that if I was to meet in any way the challenge of the question, what lies under the landscape, I needed to consider more carefully the meaning of the word landscape. What was needed to get at what lies under the landscape and the many different uses of the word landscape was a sort of verbal archaeology. I needed to look beyond the current uses of the term to its history. The archaeology of the word landscape, it has, as I will try to show, much to teach us. Although as a statement by the symposium organizers that I read you suggests, in ordinary English, the word landscape can have many different meanings and connotations, nevertheless, we can call the standard meaning of the word uh, nevertheless, the standard meaning of the word seems clear enough. Google defines landscape as all the visible features of an area of countryside or land, often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal. We should note the reference to the eye, to the countryside, and to aesthetic appeal. The word landscape brings to mind, first of all, an image of some beautiful countryside. In similar fashion, the short Oxford English Dictionary defines landscape as everything you can see when you look across a large area of land, especially in the country. The Collins English Dictionary finally gives us a twofold definition of landscape. One, a section or expanse of rural scenery, usually extensive, that can be seen from a single viewpoint. Two, a picture representing natural inland or coastal scenery. All three definitions define landscape as something that can be seen. All three definitions make the eye, and thus a human being, constitutive of landscape. So understood, there is no landscape without human observers. And there is a further suggestion that a landscape is rather like a picture seen from a single viewpoint and beautiful. We may want to question this anthropocentric understanding of landscape. Should we not define landscape more simply as all the features of an area of countryside or land? So defined, landscape would mean roughly the same as region or territory. That is indeed, if not the first, nevertheless also a familiar definition of the word. A geographer, for example, might use the term this way. But in printed English, this use of the word meaning a tract of land with its distinguishing characteristics, which elides the reference to the eye and thus to the human observer, makes its appearance only late in 1886. It is preceded by and derived from what I call the standard definition, as all the visible features of an area of countryside or land often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal. According to this definition, landscape is something to be seen. The analogy with a picture has to suggest itself. The human being, as I pointed out, is made constitutive of the landscape, but not as an engaged part of it, an actor shaping and transforming it, but as a spectator, a subject confronting what lies before her or him as if it were a picture. And this definition of landscape as all the visible features of an area of countryside or land, often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal, does seem to correspond to the way many of us today tend to think of landscape and use the term. Think of what comes to mind when we speak of lunar or Martian landscapes: pictures. Our experience of landscape today is mediated by the camera, where earlier the place of the camera was taken by the painter. To many today, taking a picture of some natural wonder seems almost essential to a full experience. In this connection, we should also think of the role advertising has played in our understanding of landscape. Arthur Danto has argued that the calendar industry has had a profound impact on our landscape tastes, where this industry, no doubt, was mindful of what it understood the taste of those it expected to buy its calendars to be. Presupposed is a preference for a certain type of landscape, rural and beautiful, that is to say, picturesque. We can speak of a progressive pictorialization of our encounter with the natural environment. It is a presupposition of our flourishing tourism industry. The history of the word is instructive. In printed English, the word landscape is a relative latecomer. It makes its first appearance only around 1600. Dutch landscape painting was then becoming popular. These painters referred to their representations of rural or natural scenery as landschaps, anglicized as landscapes. Ever since, this use of the term to refer to paintings has remained a generally accepted second use. The English learned to look at the world surrounding them with the eyes of these Dutch painters. They discovered the beauty of landscapes, both at home and abroad, especially in Italy. This helps to explain why what I call the standard definition of the English word landscape suggests an aesthetic appreciation of the environment. Landscape is seen in the image of a beautiful picture. This original meaning of the word landscape explains why landscapes still tend to be considered with reference to their aesthetic appeal. Think of landscape gardening. It seeks to transform part of the natural environment in the image of a beautiful picture. Its goal has long been the picturesque. When these Dutch painters called the works they created landscapes, they were, of course, not thinking first of all of paintings, but what of these paintings represented, the natural scenes they were familiar with and loved. The use of the word landscape as a genre of painting presupposes us an older and more fundamental understanding of the term. To state the obvious, landscape paintings represent landscapes. We might think that it was precisely this more fundamental understanding that was recovered when, as mentioned, ever since the late 19th century, many, for example, geographers, have stripped the term landscape of its pictorial and aesthetic connotations. That landscape came to be understood more objectively as simply a tract of land which is with its distinguishing characteristics. But this objectified use of the term is derivative and a relatively late development. As mentioned, in printed English, it made its first appearance only in 1886. What the Dutch painters had in mind when they painted landscape had an older and richer meaning. Under what I called the standard meaning of landscape, with its aesthetic connotation and its objectified derivative, we discovered a third, much older meaning with ethical connotations. A landscape so understood is a region whose beauty is tied to the way it is experienced by those dwelling in it as their home. It is essentially inhabited and bounded. Such a landscape invites comparison with a house. It is essentially, it bears the marks of human labor and invites comparison with a house. Landscapes so understood are habitable and homelike. Think of the Dutch landscape, so decisively shaped by human work. So understood, landscape is opposed to wilderness. In its original sense, landscape has an ethical function, as I understand the term in the ethical function of architecture. Like every building, every landscape so understood is a product of and gives expression to a specific way in which human beings have appropriated the natural environment and made it their home. Nature and human labor are here inextricably intertwined. Landscape so understood presupposes and speaks to us of the ethos that shaped it. Ethos understood as a characteristic spirit of some community. What lies under the landscape is the ethical function of all human work. Let me give an example. I just said what lies under the landscape is the ethical function of all human work. Let me give you an example. One of the most famous Dutch landscape paintings is Meindert Habermas, The Avenue at Middle Harness, now hanging in London's National Gallery. With its emphasis on horizontals and verticals, the symmetrically organized painting lets us think of Mondrian. The painting seems almost a case study in perspective. An aesthetic order prevails. Right and left are carefully balanced. The painter did not just represent what he saw, but imposed on it a structure that rendered it more beautiful. And like the painting, the represented flat landscape too has been shaped by human labor. The broad avenue, flanked by tall, scraggly, windswept trees, and framed by water-filled ditches, so characteristic of the Dutch landscape, that had to be wrested from the sea, provides the painting with its central organizing axis. Buildings are part of this landscape. The village with a church tower on the left, balanced by some farmhouses on the right. And small as they are in the picture, human beings are also an essential part of and are at home in this landscape. The self-satisfied burgher with his dog striding confidently toward us on the central avenue, the couple on the right engaged in who knows what conversation, the peasant in the lower right-hand corner absorbed in pruning his fruit trees. In their different ways, they belong to this landscape. Of special significance are the three paths in the picture. They speak of different modes of existence. The central avenue leads straight to the village with its church, the house of God. The striking furrows in the avenue, however, suggest that many choose to leave the straight road, take the road turning right, where we see the couple engaged in a very human interchange. The third, easily overlooked path leaves the avenue on the left after the first group of trees, losing itself in a comparatively unkept copse in the painting's lower left-hand corner, balancing and offering an alternative to the peasant pruning his trees in the lower right-hand corner. These three paths suggest different ways of living one's life. The third, not taken by anyone in the picture, hinting at the possibility of going astray. Now I want to
Should you hit continue?
No, I want to get rid of this picture. No, maybe you can here.
Oh, yeah, maybe here. Okay.
Human actors are very much part of the landscape I showed you. They shaped this landscape and made it their home. Landscape here means, first of all, cultivated land. In this sense, land, in this case, land wrested from the sea. Such cultivation invites comparison with building. Often, indeed, they intertwine. Think of the construction of canals or terraces that in so many parts of the world serve agriculture. Both cultivation and building share their ethical function. Under the landscape, understood according to the standard definition as all the visible features of an area of countryside or land, often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal, lies, as I have said, the essentially ethical function of landscape. To say that landscape has an ethical function is to say that it inescapably both reflects and helps shape how people have lived, live, and are going to live. Every landscape speaks to us of a shared ethos, that is the characteristic spirit of a geographically and historically placed community. This ethical function places a special burden on the members of this community. And he or she needs to look not just to today and tomorrow, but far into the future, should consider the needs of those yet unborn. But I'm getting ahead of my story, so let me return to the history of the word landscape. It supports the claim that landscape has originally an ethical function. The modern use of the English word landscape derives, as I have pointed out, from the Dutch Landschaft related to the German Landschaft, which has its closely related analogs in all the Germanic languages. The word Landschaft invites us to look at its constituent parts, Land and the suffix schaft, and its related analogs. Common to all Germanic languages, land originally means not just some bound area, but a cultivated piece of the earth, such as a field. In its origin, the word land is thus inseparably linked to agriculture, to human work. Like landscape, land requires human beings, but not as spectators who appreciate what is spread out before them aesthetically, but as cultivators of the land, whose labor lets the land belong to them and lets them belong to the land. According to this original meaning of the word, there is no land without human work. The suffix schaft and its analogs follow some noun to express a totality of what the noun refers to. The suffix gathers things into a whole. A Mannschaft is thus a team, such as a soccer team or a crew. Analogously, a landscape gathers fields, meadows, and forests into a whole. The aesthetic meaning of landscape readily suggests itself, where it is the point of view of the observer and his selective eye that gathers the observed into a whole. But more fundamental is an understanding of landscape as gathered into a whole by the work of some community. The originally ethical significance of land is underscored by the etymology of the German adjective elend, translated into English as miserable, and the noun das Elend, translated as misery. The word derives from the Middle High German Elende, suggesting the state of being without one's land, to be a foreigner. To be elend, that is to say, to be miserable, originally means to be landless, and that means homeless. The miserable person finds himself displaced in a place that is not his land. Think of the poem by Franz Werfel. For another example of misery, uh, I read you here a bit from Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that had carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Many years ago, that psalm provided me with a motto for my dissertation. It bore the title, In a Strange Land, an Exploration of Nihilism. Only a few years had passed since I reluctantly, following my parents, had left my native Germany. I had lost my land. The Bavarian landscape has kept its hold on me, even as I now know that there is no place that I can truly call home. Freedom demands both physical and spiritual mobility. Heimweh and Fernweh, nostalgia and a longing for distant places here intertwine. And this, I want to insist, is not a tension that should be resolved. Today, I take it affirmatively to be necessary for a full human life. But let me return to the German word Elend. It's in modern German, it no longer has its original meaning and signifies only a state of distress. Well translated by the English miserable. But beneath the modern meaning, under it, so to speak, remains the older meaning, according to which to be miserable is first of all to be without land that we experience as our home, land that grants us our proper place. History of the word elend thus leads us back to the ethical function of landscape buried beneath its more recent meanings. The ethical function of landscape invites another look at the ethical function of architecture. In the painting by Hobbema, I showed you they appear intimately linked. That they are indeed linked is suggested by the German word bauen. Bauen is usually translated as to build, that is to say, to erect some structure. That is the obvious translation. But in the word, we can also hear another and older meaning. To build is to cultivate, to work the earth. Agriculture is in German Ackerbau. The farmer or peasant who cultivates his fields is der Bauer. Building, so understood, is inseparable from our being here on earth, from our dwelling. In this double sense, building is constitutive of human existence. The history of the word landscape, as I have shown, points very much in the same direction. Landscape in the original sense is a product of both a caring cultivation of the earth and the raising of structures, including not just houses and temples, but structures that serve human dwelling in countless ways. Think of roads and bridges, of windmills and terraces, the last necessary to cultivate some unforgiving slope. Under every landscape lies a particular ethos, a way some community has coped with pre-given nature and has made it its own. The traditional landscapes that we admire today and that have become magnets for the tourism industry still speak to us of the underlying ethos. But must the same not be said of our modern, urban or suburban, industrial or rural landscapes? These may not be landscapes in what I call the original sense, but they too speak of the underlying ethos, even if that ethos may not be conducive to the creation of landscapes likely to attract tourists. These landscapes do not suggest what Heidegger associated with the old sense of dwelling, a cherishing and preserving of the soil. Today, we tend, uh, we tend to consider the earth something to be mastered, to be used and exploited by us as we see fit. Landscapes that speak to us of this modern ethos do not invite nostalgia for a more firmly rooted mode of existence. The ethos that shaped them is of today, marked by a spiritual and physical mobility demanded by our freedom. As mentioned, I cannot call any place on earth truly my home. I am multiply located here in Hamden, Connecticut, where I now am and have spent many years, in Bavaria, to which I so often return literally and even more in my thoughts and dreams, and now in Vieques, a small island of Puerto Rico, which has awakened the painter in me. There I paint landscapes. I consider being multiply located a privilege, not a burden. A privilege shadowed, however, by dreams of a more firmly rooted existence. But I do not want such dreams to become reality. And yet I'm also convinced that what remains of traditional landscapes still has much to teach us, a less ruthless, less damaging way of living on this earth. Let me conclude and sum up. My brief foray into the archaeology of the word landscape has suggested a sequence of three distinct definitions of the word. The first modern definition of landscape defines it simply as a tract of land with its distinguishing characteristics. It makes no reference to human beings. So understood, landscape is simply there to be neglected or studied, to be used or abused by us as we see fit. In English, the subjective definition is, as I pointed out, a latecomer appearing only in the late 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution transformed our attitude to the land and scarred many a traditional landscape. That revolution also made possible that physical and spiritual freedom that we must not surrender. But it also led to a way of life, an exploitative way of dealing with the earth that's spreading all over the globe today not only threatens what remains of traditional landscapes, but the very future of humanity. The road we have traveled threatens disaster. That invites us to reconsider how we got where we are now, invites us to learn from traditional ways of dealing with the land. In English, what I just called the most modern definition of landscape is preceded by what I, appealing to some dictionaries, called the standard definition. Perhaps I should have called it the aesthetic definition. Landscape is defined here as all the visible features of an area of countryside or land, often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal. I underscored the aesthetic connotation of landscape so understood, which makes the human observer constitutive landscape. We can trace this definition, as I pointed out, back to the Dutch painters so popular in 17th and 18th century England. The etymology of the Dutch word Landschaft and the closely related German word Landschaft leads us to a third and more fundamental definition: landscape as the product of human labor that lets us feel at home in the natural environment. So understood, a landscape is not altogether unlike a house. And like every house, indeed all human work, it has an ethical function. This evolution of the meaning of the word landscape, from the ethical to the aesthetic to the modern, reflects the evolution of our relationship to the land, to time, and to each other. refracted no doubt by countless regional differences. That evolution could be described as a progressive loosening of the power of place, place understood both spatially and temporally over our existence, a loosening that is the other side of the progress of freedom. With this, our attitude to the land has to change. Distance no longer limits us in the way it once did. There is a sense in which my computer, although inevitably in some place, is equidistant from all places. And are many of us not becoming more and more like that computer? Place is no longer fate. What is what I called landscape in its original sense to us today? Think of Therasia. Traditional landscapes still speak strongly to us today and strangely move us. But the conditions that shaped them no longer exist. The world to which they once belonged has perished. The way we relate to earth and sky, to past and future, and to each other has changed. The intimate tie that once joined human beings to particular landscape has been loosened or even cut. Traditional landscape no longer meet our needs. But why then do they so often awaken nostalgia for a past that has perished, for some landscape that we might call home? I suggested that while nostalgia may estrange us from the world we live in, it can also have a critical function. Nostalgia may contribute towards the establishment of a better future. Our love of traditional landscape is inevitably also a love of this earth, which remains our home, a home we need to cherish and protect, preserve and care for. I have argued that full self-affirmation requires an affirmation of the never quite resolved tension between our need for freedom and our need for place, between dreams of journeying into the unknown and dreams of homecoming. Why did we travel to the moon? We are curious creatures, and curiosity calls us again and again beyond familiar places and the associated points of view and perspectives, calls us away from what we once called home. The loss of paradise will be repeated over and over by human curiosity. Relentlessly, curiosity bids us embark on ever new voyages of discovery. As science has opened our life world to the universe, not only particular landscapes, but this earth has become ever less homelike, more and more like a ship lost in an endless ocean, embarked on a voyage with no clear goal. This earth, which once, because of what we believe to be its central position in a finite cosmos, was thought to provide human beings with a privileged place, has come to be understood as just another among countless stars. But just as we have come to see the insignificance of human life here on Earth when measured by the space and time of the cosmos, we also have come to an increased awareness that for all practical purposes, we are alone in the cosmos, that this Earth is the only home that we shall ever have. The exploration of space, including the vain search for extraterrestrials, has led to an ever clearer understanding that we have no other home than this fragile Earth, and we better learn to love and to take good care of it. Despite our freedom, we remain earthbound mortals. Our bodies and the earth to which we belong remain the ground of all meaning. What then do we find under the landscape? This earth, our true home. The beauty of landscapes can teach us to love and care for it. And as we all know, the earth is very much in need of such care. At stake is the future of humanity. I thank you for your attention.